I have a question for the rabbi.
You're on air.
All right. In your opinion, when did Judaism take the mystical turn for the worst?
Oof. The turn for the worst, Rabbi. When did it become all mystical?
We classify eras in the Jewish world by the gadol of that age, by the head rabbi who speaks for that generation. So we know that up to the time of Rav Tzadok Gaon, mysticism or the mystical approach wasn't that prevalent. But we see him attack notions of demons and reincarnation. But the simple fact that he has to respond to it means that the belief existed amongst the Jewish people. There's a lot of mysticism in the Talmud as well as in the Mishnah. I know many times I bash the Zohar, but this really predates the Zohar. There's a lot of portions that the Rambam excluded from Mishneh Torah. There's times that he presents a halacha differently because the way it appears in the Mishnah makes it seem that that law came out of some pagan ritual. He tries to clean it up or in many times exclude it from his codification. There's a lot of weird things in books that were canonized as well by the judges, by the rabbis. That is why I'm not a big fan of elevating books of the prophets and the writings to the level of the Torah. Because there's some statements like this notion of Michael or naming angels. Like now, like they're not just almost an extension of God. Now they're a separate entity. I think this is outside influence affecting what we call the Bible. So this is why I really, in terms of what I teach, I limit it to the 5 books of Moses. Apart from halakha and the oral law, in Tanakh, I limit it to the 5 books of Moses just because there's a lot of weird ideas that appear in the books of the prophets. The job of the prophet is there to bring Israel back to the Torah. The job of the books of the prophets is to give you a historical rendition of what happened throughout history, not necessarily by people who were there, but that what was floating around in folklore and legend. It's fine. It could also amplify the message and tell us that if God behaved like this back then, it could behave like this in the future. Like when did Judaism take a huge mystical nosedive? It got really worse with the Zohar. I think the Zohar popularized all the dangerous mystical ideas in the Talmud. And the Arizal made the Zohar popular. And Chabad made the teachings of the Arizal popular. Now, regarding Sephardi Judaism, no, actually Arizal was Sephardi, but it was after the death of Shabtai Tzvi that Sephardi Judaism took a huge mystical nosedive. And this is why Sephardi Judaism today doesn't resemble Sephardi Judaism of the time of the Rambam or the Chachamim of Aleppo and the Golden Age of Spain. This is why it's important to know Jewish history, because you're able to see the big picture and you won't be so quick to fall into some cult or some sect. I guess I don't have an answer to that question. I mean, but when did it actually go downhill? I don't know.
So, Rabbi, let me ask you this. Sorry. So, do you think that the Midrash, Zohar, Tanya, the whole Hasidut thing, the Chachma Bin and Das, all these things are optional to believe, or do you have to believe in these things to be a Jew?
I'm sure there's concepts in the Tanya that come straight from the Torah. There's concepts in the Quran that also appear in the Torah. So there is no concept that is completely erroneous or evil. But anything that appears in the Tanya that's not a repetition of what's in the Torah, it's optional to believe, because everything metaphysical has to come from the Torah for it to be authoritative. Everything metaphysical. Regarding law, the Torah allowed judges to create laws, not to replace Torah laws, but to create consensus in a society. So, using that as a roadmap, you're able to know what you must believe and what's optional to believe. If it appears in the Torah regarding belief, it's mandatory. If it appears in Hasidut or in Kabbalah, it's optional. And Kabbalah, for all intents and purposes, is Agadah and Midrash. It's the same. I mean, it's just tales and folklore and legend. I think that's the easiest way to approach that question. If it's in the Torah and it's legal and it's mystical, it's obligatory. If it's in the rabbis, only if it's legal is it obligatory. And again, that's only rabbis who had smicha, which means rabbis in the Mishnah. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, fair enough. It's good.
So when did the Haftorah schedule come about? How long do we have? Like,
there's no such thing as a Haftorah schedule. Even though if you open up Art Scroll Chumash, that you'll see them all like aligned there. Even with that rendition, Chabad has different Haftorahs that they read at different times, and Sephardim have different Haftorahs they read at different times. I'm pretty sure that this must have been post 1920s or something.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because don't forget, people wouldn't be reading 55 or 56 Haftorahs a year, where they would be reading 150 Haftorah years. Why? Because the halacha, at least as expressed in the Mishnah, is that the Torah is read every 3 years. Once every 3 years, not once every year. Which would lead you to believe, unless you're reading the same portions over and over again, unless even though the law was to read or the custom was to read the Torah every 3 years, they in some way were going to read the Haftorahs every year. Now, of course not. They would read the Haftorahs also every 3 years, which means that the halacha is that as long as you read a portion of the prophets, you fulfill your obligation to read the prophets. There's no set reading. Now, the Talmud does say what you shouldn't read from. There's some segments of Ezekiel that they say should never be used for the Haftorah. Okay. But even those segments, they included it. Daniel is not considered a prophet.
Right.
It doesn't appear like in the Haftorahs, but that doesn't mean it's not studied. It's just not read, weekly.
Well, I was under the impression it wasn't studied very well. I mean, it's kind of one of the things I spoke to Tovia about. There's commentary in general.
There aren't too many commentaries on Tanakh in general in Judaism compared to the Chumash. I mean, for the Parsha, there's tons of commentaries, but there aren't too many for the other books. But I think Jews study the book of Daniel as much as they study the book of Isaiah. Right? I mean, the difference is we read Isaiah in the Haftorah, but there's whole books that we exclude from the Haftorah, by the way.
Yeah.
For those who say that, I don't know how you feel about this myth that they made up of the forbidden verse, but the whole book of Nahum is never read in the Haftorah. It's also like a book of the prophets. What are we hiding from there?
Well, okay, so if it didn't come about till you say like 1920s, then did they ever circle around to Isaiah 53 ever? Like, because
it is a possibility when they were putting together this modern day schedule that they specifically left out Isaiah 53 because of Jesus. I mean, that's clearly possible, but they can attribute that to the rabbis in the Talmud. They could definitely attribute that to rabbis in the last 200 years.
Gotcha. And so, I didn't know it was that early. I really didn't, or that late. Sorry. So that's new information to me. And I guess that would make sense, especially considering all of the anti-Semitism and the rampant,
Every community had their own tradition, and without the internet and without telephones, I mean, how can people even know what parsha they were on? The holiday of Simchas Torah, it's a holiday made up by Ashkenazim. But there's no holiday like this in the Talmud, where people dance to the Torah every year after they read it. It's because the Torah wasn't read every year. So this is one example why the Zohar is not authentic, because the Zohar was initially just a commentary to the Torah, but it was split up by parshas. Now, being that the parshas were developed much, much later, how could it have been written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who lived in the land of Israel before there were parsha names and before they started reading the Torah every year instead of every 3 years? Because the way the Zohar is broken down, it's broken down in the yearly cycle. So it shows that it must have been written post the 13th century. But that being said, the trilineal reading done by the conservatives doesn't match the reading that was done traditionally by Jews, just because the 3-year cycle was read just like the 1-year cycle is read nowadays. It's continuous. While the trilineal cycle that's done by Reform and some conservative synagogues, this week you could read from Genesis and next week you could read from Leviticus. It's not in order. Not that would make it wrong, but it's just not traditionally how they did it. Yeah. You could look it up online. I
would ask, like, how do you find that information? Like, I wouldn't even know what to, like, really search for.
There's a trilineal calendar that breaks it down online. Like, just type in trilineal Jewish reading or something like that. But again, it's just someone who split up the Bible into 150 readings instead of 55 readings or 56, 54, I don't remember.
Well, I mean, in the New Testament, we have a reference to Yeshua reading from, Isaiah, which would indicate that it might have been the Haftorah portion. But you know what I'm saying? Like, I didn't know how they cycled that around.
No, they didn't cycle it. Any synagogue had the right to read from any part of the prophets. As long as they read from a portion of the prophets, it doesn't matter. So that could have exactly happened, that he took the scroll of Isaiah, and that's what it says. And he read that portion, right? It wasn't that it was a coincidence that portion for that day. But the halacha is that you just have to read from a portion of the prophets. The tradition is that the Syrian Greeks, when they outlawed the study of Torah, like during the time of the Maccabees, this forced the judges to say that we're going to read a part of the prophets that has something to do with the parsha that we would have read, or with a segment of Torah. It's not for sure that this happened. This is one legend on where we got the command to read the Haftorah.
Okay.
But I've heard rabbis correct me and say that it's just a myth. So,
well, just to kind of give context, it said when he went to Netzeret, where he had brought up, on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue as was his custom. He stood up, and the scroll, the prophet Isaiah, was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it was written. Okay, I see. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, gotcha. So he just read a portion of it. Now, the Talmud does say how much you have to read. And regarding to Aliyahs, it says how it should end. How I think a parsha has to end on a high note, and there has to be so many Aliyahs. Right, on Shabbat they give like 7. There are rules, but not necessarily to what it's read. Right. I mean, don't forget, chapter breaks and verses were instituted much, much later. So how would someone know where to stop?
Okay.